moving on, we have a panel about identifying the users of tomorrow. This is a topic that I'm actually personally quite interested in around decentralized identity. It's also very, very relevant to privacy and consumer privacy, fuck business privacy, and where we're, obviously what the whole topic of this conference has been. So I want to remind you again, there's the Slido. Feel free to ask questions. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the three panelists to the stage. We've got Julio from Fractal. Come on, take a seat. We've also got George from Kleros. And I'm really going to struggle with this. I haven't met you before, so. Zvezdin. No? Ah. Come up, and then you're going to teach me how to say it. All good. Well, thanks a lot for coming, guys. And yeah, we're going to start here, and please say your name correctly. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries. It's really a tongue twister. I make too much fun of people who don't pronounce it. So I'm Zvez. I'm one of the founders of ETHDam, which is a fully private way to verify government IDs. So we've developed one of the first ZK ways to directly verify attestations about users. So let's say I'm over 18, without sending your identity data to a third party to prove that.
Cool, thank you. We can carry on the intros.
Hi, I'm George. I work for Kleros. I'm an engineer. We built the Kleros court system as well as Proof Humanity, which is an identity solution that's decentralized.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Julio. I'm a co-founder at Fractal, and we do identity verification in a way that caters well to crypto companies and protocols. But that's what we focus on, verification itself.
Cool. Thanks a lot, guys. So to start off, because I think decentralized identity, DIDs, verifiable credentials, all of these things is now starting to become like one of the trends that's in the space. I was wondering if, between the three of you, if you could try and shortly define what decentralized identity actually is and kind of what it stands for.
So I think DID is a direct consequence of having self-custody over your assets. So you've got your own private key, that is your identity basically. And all the derivatives of how DIDs are used today is basically one identity saying something about another identity. So I'm signing a message which says something about you, and therefore that is part of your identity.
So for me, I think identity, in a way, it's something that has been around for a couple of centuries, and now with technology, it's kind of moving into a direction where people can own the identity, and they can own their reputation, and they can really build something out. The question was a bit about the future as well. There's a couple of competing systems right now. I think they will all shine in their own way. I think some will be very well suited for DeFi, some will be very well suited for freelance jobs, that sort of thing. And yeah, it's still very early on to say, at least.
So identity is not something that is inherently centralized, or at least not, you know, sometimes the issuance is. If you have a government ID, the creation of that ID is a centralized process, but your identity is a lot more than that. And identity has always been decentralized. Like you store your documents on yourself. You show them to whoever you like. The issue is Web 2 centralized a lot of our identity. The internet doesn't come with an identity layer. So Web 2 did a lot of centralization efforts. And for me, decentralized identity is not something you know, new and unique that only Web 3 can bring. It's more about going back to the roots of what makes sense, which is it's your identity, you keep it, you own it, you do whatever you want with it, instead of delegating that to a federation or to Google or to whomever. So yeah, I see it as going back to the roots.
A very important route, I think. Just interested from a show of hands of the people that are here, who's familiar with the travel rule for crypto transactions? Okay, that's maybe around just under half or so. So the travel rule is becoming quite important, and I'm wondering if one of you maybe wants to give a very quick explanation of that, and then we're going to touch on the travel rule and how that interacts with identity in the space.
Sure. It's quite simple. It's one of the bullshit AML measures that essentially mandates anybody that facilitates a transaction to send along information about the sender and the receiver of that transaction. So for example, when you make a bank transfer, the bank you make the transfer with will take some information about you and send it along with that transaction to the receiving bank on the other side. And they also need to know who the receiver is going to be. So this is, I'm not a lawyer, but this is kind of the gist of it.
And how much of the ecosystem, roughly, do you think is actually already implementing the travel rule, where there is identity actually being sent to and from?
Well, I think it's very little right now because it's not something that has come into force. So we've had a lot of discussions in the EU, for example, recently with the TFR, and it is something that centralized, like exchanges, asset providers, are going to have to implement. It's not something that applies to, and I quote the regulation, sufficiently decentralized protocols and applications. And it remains to be seen what that means. But this, for me, is actually really cool because it pushes, if you don't like it, then you move away from a SEX and you go into decentralization proper because the rule doesn't apply there, or at least not for now.
Yeah. Yeah, and the reason why this is relevant is ultimately we're talking about identifying the users of tomorrow, and it's becoming increasingly important or necessary that exchanges and SEXs are KYCing users, but that does have a privacy concern. So I'm interested in hearing from you guys around kind of what your privacy concerns would be around the implementation of the travel rule, obviously, yeah, SEXs that exist in the space.
Well, at least my take on this would be that, and that combined with any other form of more centralized identity verification is that, well, user data would have to be sent around between institutions. So this institution has to keep a copy, then the next one has to keep a copy, or if not a copy, then both of them have to access this. Same thing with KYC, or at least the way it's currently being enforced. And that creates lots of honeypots and lots of opportunities for us to really push regulation forward and make an example of how it should be built instead of just blindly complying with it.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to this.
Yeah, I don't think I do either. I think it's actually a good thing because we should not be using centralized products if we can avoid them. And if privacy here is a concern for you, then, well, use blockchains the way they were meant to be used.
Yeah. And so that's where, I guess, can you guys talk a little bit about how digital identity really can enable kind of a more privacy-centric operation of kind of while complying with regulations or all of these upcoming regulations?
Right. So at least the angle we're taking with Audit is trying to do as much as we can in building a full ZK instrument which can prove that you're not on the OFAC list. You can prove that you're not on the adverse media or PEPs or whatever other sanctions list out there. You can prove that you're of eligible age, of an eligible jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you're just not storing your identity document with that provider. And with the way regulations are being written, vague enough so that this might comply if there is a precedent for it. And then that's what we're trying to push for personally.
So I don't think regulators have been very transparent or forthcoming yet with what they're expecting, so it's a bit hard to kind of say now whether we comply with that or not. But in terms of privacy, I don't know if people know our system, Proof Humanity, but the data itself is public, but then there are other projects like Sysmo that comes on and they release a feature where you can verify that someone is a human without actually knowing who that human is. Again, with the same CK kind of stuff. So this layering of technology probably provides nice avenues for the future, but in terms of regulators, I think it's still too early to tell where that is going to go and yeah, where everything will end up.
It depends a lot on goodwill. So as you were saying, like indeed there's a lack of regulatory clarity, and it might be that regulations are being written to push us out. But if you assume the best in regulators, which often it is the case, they're operating within a certain framework that was given to them, and they're trying to make things better for everyone within that framework, then it's not a conspiracy. And so I found often that folks there are very, very reasonable, and if they understand how we are working towards meeting the regulations that they create and towards informing the regulations they will create, they're very often receptive. And they're very often understanding, because at the end of the day, they are there to protect the people. And if you show them how what you build does that even better, or makes that less worse at least, then often I found folks to be very receptive.
And how to say it, maybe this is a little bit too much of a game, but if the audience right now was the regulators, and you could say one thing to the regulators, given how much the future depends on having verifiable identity and all of that stuff, what would you guys say?
You don't have to be custodian of all information in order to prove that you've done your job or you've done the checks.
Well, it's tricky. I mean, if you look at innovation, I mean, the Russians tried it with the internet. They tried to kind of stop that, and it didn't really help them further. If our countries now, wherever you're from, do the same thing, what they end up doing is risking a lot of innovation, being in that country, and probably moving away. So, yeah, with any kind of innovation and technology, it's always good to be gentle and transparent. And like you said, to assume the good in people, and yeah, to care for it, to nurture it.
I would say that something that is probably important to enforce is to use the fact that your identity can be stored in a decentralized way. So if you want to protect consumers from leaks that happen all of the time, actually mandate institutions to store personal information in decentralized networks so that they don't become honeypots. And it doesn't need to be a network. It could also be a data wallet. But we do have the technology. It is a lot safer than keeping things in S3. And so just enforce that.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. It's one of the reasons why I'm interested in the topic. Is my big concern is that VASP providers become honeypots one way or another of user information, and that the ecosystem doesn't necessarily know that it's happening. That's like yeah. So I guess that in a few minutes I'll ask some of the Slido questions. So if you have any questions, please do put them on there. So I guess like my big last question is, what do you think is holding back the adoption of decentralized identity within the ecosystem right now?
I think the main thing is a user-focused or a use case-focused approach. There's many people building identity infrastructure, pretty much everyone. But we've got too many DID frameworks, but who has DIDs here in the room? And have you used it for something? So it's about building actual tangible real-world use cases. And it's a use case that's not just spanning, hey, you can use it in Aave and you can get an extra NFT or something, but an actual tangible real-world benefit that even maybe your mom can feel as well. Well, then we can properly scale DIDs.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I would just add to that. Identity is such a building block. If the space can figure out how this works, the amount of public good it can do anywhere in the world is kind of huge. Wherever you are, if you can get a loan through an identity that's on chain, it can have massive impact in the real world. And yeah, I think right now there aren't really any killer apps yet. I don't think we have helped enough people. But come 5-10 years time, it might look all very different.
I completely agree with that. It's a matter of use cases. Today, by far, the biggest identity use case on any kind of place in Web3 is KYC compliance, AML compliance. That's what people use it for. And as long as that's all that people use it for, then there's not going to be a lot of changes. The only one that we see is that as more and more crypto companies actually build all or most of their backends in blockchains, then the decentralized identity stack actually fits the way smart contracts work a lot better than a system like OAuth, for example, like contracts don't call APIs. And so it is definitely not going to come from somebody being like, oh man, my identity is so cool, I want to decentralize it. No, nobody gives a shit. And is it more private? Yeah, who cares about that? Nobody. Like, Apple is the only company in the whole world that ever managed to make privacy like part of the debate, and only because it was cool, because Apple is cool. That's it. Nobody actually cares. It's not going to come from users, from normal folks that feel like, oh, if my identity is kept this way, this is better for me. It is going to come from builders in the space taking responsibility and actually using decentralized identity systems, because then they become something that people have to do or have to participate in order to play in the space. So it's on us.
Mm. And on that note, could you all give me two decentralized identity use cases and basically why you're super into that particular use case? A little bit quick fire. Two use cases and why you think that use case is very important. That's not KYC AML.
That's not KYC and AML. Okay. So for me, one of them is actually proof of personhood. So, and the other is proving your age online. I think there's many use cases for upcoming regulations with adult entertainment, gambling, and things like this.
Yeah, I think human registries can open up new avenues for DeFi. I also think it can maybe help also in governance, reducing trolls and that sort of thing, and kind of build a different kind of system that is more positive. But with anything that's in the future, it's always hard to tell. So whether it's these two that I mentioned or 5 others, we'll see.
I think that two things that we're going to see not too long in the future that identity does enable are going to be things like under-collateralized loans. So actually making loans accessible for the purpose that most loans are supposed to be used for, which is something that you can do if you can tie it to a person that you either trust or that you know that you can bring enforcement against. But honestly, the reason I'm primarily excited about it is because the more Fractal users that actually adopt the decentralized identity solution, then the less passports I've got in a honeypot that I need to protect, and sleeping at night is really good. So that is primarily why I'm excited, because I don't want to be a honeypot. I want that as little as possible in my life.
Cool, thanks a lot. And I also just realized I'm very intimidated by all of your beards. I'm very jealous right now.
It was twice bigger yesterday.
Okay, on to the audience questions. There are 2 right now. The first one is, how unique should be a DID? What are the consequences of having multiple DIDs?
So I think this is mostly only relevant when we're talking about the proof of personhood concept. So when you're trying to say that one person has to have one identity and that's it, to prevent all kinds of people attacks, governance votes, etc., etc. So in this case, that would be very critical, and that's actually one of the main challenges in building such kind of systems is that we can do proof of personhood in one way. Then proof of humanity does it in a completely different way. So if someone signs up for the 2 systems, how do you deduplicate it among the 2? Because most likely the end use case, some DAO which wants to enable this for governance, will have to cover multiple systems, because no single system is going to identify every single user. And so, yeah, how do you do that is a pretty challenging topic.
It's a good question. I think what's most important is that users have choice. Every platform has different trade-offs, something you have to sacrifice, whether it's a video of yourself or a passport or whatever it is. So to give users options in what they can use, multiple or one, eventually, it might get consolidated into a DApp where you can use any of these platforms or not. But at the end of the day, the more choice to users anywhere is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a lot about choice, and not just in terms of choice of who you choose to make statements about you and to publish those statements. Like, is it Fractal? Is it someone else? I think it's important to realize that for most use cases that identity is involved, it's kind of irrelevant to know whether or not you're unique. So for scenarios of, say, one person, one vote, it is obviously critical. For scenarios of compliance, it doesn't really matter. I can have, if I have an account with a provider with one of my documents and an account with another provider with the same document or a different one, if I'm trying to buy a token that is a security, all that matters to the other end is that they have identified me. Uniqueness doesn't really matter there. So your identity is something that you should be able to compose and reveal at will, given a certain use case. And being unique, showing that you are unique within a certain set, is only one of those use cases. Mm. DIDs are supposed to be unique by definition, and but not in terms of corresponding to a unique human in meat space, just each DID. And you can have 20 if you want to, and that's fine.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think this really is a big problem in terms of how to do that. I hadn't thought about it in that clear context yet. Interested in your answer to this question from the audience. Are we moving in, I guess, the direction that is desired with the European Digital Identity Project?
You mean EBSI?
I guess so.
So I'll comment on the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure or initiative, I think.
I think the identity is something that's separate from that, actually.
So what I'm aware of is that something related to the EBSI is building a digital identity framework for example, sending out your university diploma as a digital credential, which then you can prove on, or your COVID test certificate, or other things like this. So I think that's yet another example of let's build another identity infrastructure. Now, this one actually has a much bigger potential for scaling. Versus, let's say, a commercial-led standardization solution, because then they can force all the universities and all the public institutions to actually issue credentials here. And I don't know where everyone has to support them because there's massive volume here. So it solves the chicken and egg that many other identity problems are struggling with. With that said, it also underlines the fact that there will be massive fragmentation in the way DIDs are being issued and used right now, because you've got the EBSI, then India has their own system, and then let's say the way passports or ID cards are signed is a completely different digital system, because they've got NFC chips which are signed. And so, for the end consumer of the DID, there's a big hurdle. Like the end consumer, I mean the platform itself. There's a big hurdle of how do you actually integrate, accommodate, and use everything seamlessly.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this initiative, so I don't really have a comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what initiative it refers to, although like, if it is about pushing or forcing institutions to prepare themselves to issue verifiable credentials, much like you should be forcing social networks to, allow for the easy export of your social graph to something else, then it makes total sense. Because like folks are then in control because they have portability and they can vote with their feet. If it is about that, fully down. But I don't actually know.
Except obviously the Europeans' way of doing this is authoritative. In the end, it's still decentralized network, but it's permissioned at the top, and then they can change the history and things like this. So,
yeah, I think one comment I have on this is when you compare the governance systems to, for example, the European Union, to, I'm going to be blunt about it, a country like China that ultimately is very pro-blockchain. They really have the ability to force a standard upon their entire economy, which is a power that the European Union just doesn't have. And from a speed perspective, in terms of rolling out technology like this, obviously in different variations and different colors, it really is a benefit that they ultimately have over the European Union when it comes to pushing out technology. I use benefit very loosely. So yeah. I guess one more question is, how do you make DIDs chain agnostic?
That's probably to do with integration. So at this point, DIDs will almost certainly be issued in different places. Like I said, India will issue them in their own system, Europe will issue them in their own system, then Polygon ID will have some credentials, and then Fractal has their own credentials and stuff. So how do you build a layer on top of this, which will integrate which will make it seamless, and actually bring real world use cases to the issued credentials?
I can only speak of my project. Proof of Humanity v2 is releasing soon, and it's going to be on Ethereum and Gnosis chain. It's not entirely agnostic, but it's going to be less constrained to just Ethereum. How the technical details work, probably best to revert to our lead developer, Andre, who's working on the project and smart contracts and bridges. I think creating an identity on layers where it's cheaper to do transactions is going to help tremendously with onboarding and paying 100 to 200 euros for a gas fee transaction to make your identity is a big fee for anybody. So I think it's a good thing.
Well, let's say DIDs have nothing to do with the blockchain. Blockchains are one place they can be stored, one place in which they can operate. They're already born chain agnostic. So as we build, let's try to maintain it that way. And we do that by making sure that we all follow the good work of the W3C and we follow their standards. And by doing that, you still only are becoming interoperable in one layer, which is like the format in which the DID should be in and the format in which verifiable credentials should be in. And still, across different providers, you might have a game that is, once gives you a credential for a high score, and that's going to be high underscore score, rather than high dash score or just high score a single word. So that's another standard that would probably be convenient if it would exist. It is not going to exist. It's extremely unlikely. Folks are going to, even if they follow the same credential formats, they're still going to be very, very opinionated about what they put in there. Users are able to issue credentials themselves. So a lot of interoperability is going to exist through curation and through making sure that there's translation layers that can help aggregate related data from credentials by different issuers into a coherent representation. So I think that's also going to never go away.
Cool. Thanks. The very last question I have, and you only get to use one word as an answer. How many years are we away from mainstream usage of DIDs? I just want to hear a number.
2.
5.
5.
Okay. Well, there we have it. We're somewhere between 2 and 5 years away from mainstream adoption of DIDs. Thank you ever so much, guys, for coming.